How you guys doing? We're talking about Pocono in this race. Now, when we look back at last year's race and look back at where this track was in the schedule and really put everything into context, I have an hypothesis. And that being that Pocono is the most difficult track for this next-gen car. Okay, so let's kind of go back and see how things were before, how things were after, and yada, yada, yada. And so if you remember last year, introduction to the next-gen car, everything like that, we quickly found out that this car does not like bottoming out. We saw that in Las Vegas, Atlanta, and the car does not like being upset like that. As we continued on and we kind of got past that issue and the teams figured out that, they then ran into the situation where they were putting or they weren't respecting the guidelines that Goodyear was providing them regarding these new tires in terms of air pressure. We saw a lot of teams pushing the envelope, causing tire failures and tire incidents, things like that. And while we did have some instance this weekend of tire failures, this was really the stepping off point of where that stuff really necessarily wasn't a concern past this point last year. With that said, we saw a lot of single car incidents, not just in practice but in this race. We saw a lot of crashes in this race last year that weren't necessarily cars get into each other and cars absolutely wiping each other out. A lot of it was single car incidents. So yes, we have the Hamlin-Chastain incident, but a lot of it was a lot of cars getting spun sideways or a lot of drivers going past the slip angle of the tire and getting involved in wrecks and things like that. Okay, like this is pretty huge. Pocono is typically a race that goes green, specifically before this car and even before the later years of the Gen 6. We'd see this race go green and be a fuel mileage race, yada, yada, yada. There's a lot of incidents, okay? And when you look back, Denny Hamlin spins out the tunnel turn, gets a little too low on the apron, spins out. LaJoie spins out by himself. McDowell gets involved in some situations here. The 482 spins. Ryan Blaney has a massive crash out of turn 3, and so on and so forth. Then we have, this race, or this last crash in the race with Chastain and Hamlin, with a chalk Chastain being wrecked out and yada, yada, yada. And also, this doesn't matter. Like, who cares if Hamlin and Kyle Busch got DQ'd? We're not playing FanDuel, and if you do, okay, well, then it sucked for you then, but we're playing DraftKings. This is what we want. Joe Gibbs just had the best cars, which, yet again, actually, we'll touch on this point again anyway. Going back to the single car instance, going back to these drivers kind of going over the boundary and causing themselves to self-spin and things like that, that was something that we didn't necessarily see to this extent before this race or prior. It was this one track, this one instance, this one weekend as a whole that caused that, and that may be due to two factors. One, as I said, these drivers were still getting used to this car, so on and so forth. It could be the track changing, because we did see a lot of instances in the Xfinity Series race last year as well, but I don't really like to bring up Xfinity and Cup Series, how each of those races go when we're just looking at the Cup Series and things like that, but it is important to note. I have to believe that it's the speed that these cars are carrying in, the lack of side force that these cars have, and the lack of grip that the track has, not only due to the track aging, but due to the low angle of these corners. Okay, these drivers don't have a lot to lean on, and as soon as they go over that edge, they're just going to spin out. Where I'm at least right now, is I think that we might run into a situation if practice follows the same form. I think practice will be a good indicator. I think qualifying will be a good indicator. If you remember last year in qualifying, Kurt Busch probably has the worst wreck in Pocono's history. It was a violent wreck. It was a terrifying wreck. I think in Pocono's entire history at this track, no other car has wrecked as violent as that 45 car. I think I speak for everybody when I say Kurt Busch had the worst crash, the worst time, the worst experience at the track named Pocono Raceway. That was probably the worst wreck in Pocono's history, and that's just how it is. By far the worst wreck. If you look at every single series that has raced here at Pocono, by far the worst crash. And it kills Kurt Busch, basically. Kurt Busch is dead, and he would be the only fatality to ever happen here at Pocono, the only injury to ever happen here at Pocono. If you remember that happening in qualifying. We also have just other instances, other situations of guys getting loose, guys just going over that edge to cause them to self-spin and things like that. So if we see that again in practice, and we see it again in qualifying, I think there's a good chance we see it in the race. These cars have a not a tremendous amount. They have a really, really good time running sideways, but in terms of sliding up the track, in terms of being able to save the car, it's a very little. When we see the starts and we see the restarts here, like when we look at Denny Hamlin's wreck, I'm pretty sure that's right out of a restart. So they go green, they go for one lap. This is when these crashes are happening. They're pretty early in, at least, and this is the back of the field, and this was right after a restart. This is right after another restart. We're seeing a lot of these incidents, just happen during restarts because drivers aren't able to get in the lines they want. They're being forced 2-3 wide, especially going through like tunnel turn fucking 2 wide. You don't want to be doing that. Anyway, where I'm at is I think we can run to an incident, or we can run to a situation where this weekend's Pocono race for the Cup Series might mirror the weekend last year for the Cup Series. I just think that this is a very, very difficult track, and kind of similar to Ty Dillon. I mean, clearly salaries aren't out yet, but men's salary guys, I think they do have I believe they have a real chance of at least getting 5 or 6 positions and stuff. If not, we might even have more wrecks because there's a lot more guys this year desperate for wins. Okay, at this point, we were getting deep into the year. A lot of guys already qualified for the playoffs and stuff. We have a lot of big names so far this year that don't have wins, that aren't locked in. Last year's winner, Chase Elliott, is pretty much in needing to win, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so this point that I was going to return to is Joe Gibbs was stupid fast this race. Whether it was Satellite Team 2311, whether it was Joe Gibbs in general, they were the fastest cars, okay? They were the fastest cars entering these races, even though they didn't have the finishes to support it. They had the race speed in the races prior to this to support this. They continued on being fast throughout the year. So we can very easily see that the mirror of if you were fast at other tracks last year that were 1.5s, that were intermediates, you most likely would carry a lot of speed to here at Pocono and to Michigan, okay? So some people might like this, some people might, whatever the case may be. When you look at current form this year, who's up there? Okay, so it's not necessarily one team, but we're seeing drivers be able to replicate, be able to show up, be fast week in and week out at intermediate tracks. I understand that people might, there ain't nothing familiar with Dover and Pocono. Well, everything that I say, man, Dover and Charlotte go well together. Dover, Charlotte, Kansas go well together. These tracks go well together. If you have speed at intermediates, you're going to have speed at Pocono. You're going to have speed at Michigan. Okay, it might not be a quad oval, but when you're looking at tracks in terms of tie top speed, speed by yourself, if you have single car speed, because you're not going to be racing side by side here past the restarts. If you have speed in the corners, if you can carry speed, if you can roll the corners, you're going to be great, okay? What tracks do you need to roll the corners through? All these tracks here in different ways, but it's still important, okay? So for me personally, I'm looking at all 5 of these races, okay? I talked about it, when we enter the month of May, you want to rely heavily on these. I don't necessarily want to look at Las Vegas because that was, in the grand scheme of things, that was years ago. That doesn't matter, Dan Weldon could have died. A few months ago. That's basically what Las Vegas feels to me. I want to focus on these 5 tracks. And so who has been fast? Is there teams that we're seeing being fast here? And one thing that we are noting, both at the short tracks, starting to see a little bit in the intermediate tracks, is we're starting to see Hendrick slowly take a step back. Now, Byron is certainly still there. Top 5 contender nearly in every one of these races in most situations. But we are seeing that Joe Gibbs is starting to make a comeback. They're starting to be more consistent, specifically as a whole unit. Okay? We're seeing that not just on the short tracks, but even here, when we look back at last weekend's race at New Hampshire, Joe Gibbs is there, which honestly, the argument for current form, I look at intermediates, but in my head, I'm like, you need to pay attention of who's been good all around, who's good week to week, who's showing up. Joe Gibbs is clearly taking a step up. I think they are need to be considered more and more. For the longest time, it was very much just lock Byron in, lock Larson in. Even if they don't fucking lead, they're not killing your lines. At this point, I have to say that Larson is a bit of a viability, or a liability, not viability. He's a bit of a liability because he's not having the speed that I want to see out of him. He's not getting what I want to see out of him. I'm seeing that from Joe Gibbs. I'm still seeing that from William Byron. But we're seeing other teams and other people slowly move up, and we're seeing the rest of Hendrick kind of bump their way down. I'm curious to see what DraftKings does with the salary this week. But when we look at the people who are going to carry speed into Pocono, regardless of what they did last weekend at New Hampshire, because it's a drastically different track, it's Joe Gibbs. I'm leaning towards Truex. I think Hamlin is going to be a very, very fast car this weekend. I think Bell is going to have a good time. I understand, what happened with Bell this last weekend, but you got to put that stuff behind. You got to have a short memory. You got to look at what everything's saying. And even last weekend, Bell, hindsight being a bad play, didn't work out. But everything says play him. How many situations are you going to just fade the guy who has number one pit stall? How many times are you going to fade a guy who was clearly getting fast laps and traffic? It's very rare that you ever want to fade the pole sitter just on a whim. Everything's pointing to Bell. Practice, qualifying, having the pit road. It was just a situation where it didn't work out. I see no reason to not play Bell this weekend. I see no reason to not play Truex this weekend. I'm interested in what Chastain can bring in practice. But for the most part, we're going to, we can kind of go through, look, all right, here, Truex, Hamlin, Byron. I think Elliott is going to probably swing for the fences. I think they're going to lean heavily. And I think you're probably better placed for Hendrick this weekend might end up being Elliott and Byron. And I understand you can't play all these guys because some guy was like, well, you can't play all these guys. That's why you play a lot of lineups, brother. That's why you diversify your portfolio and stuff. But it's probably these 5 individual drivers that I'm most curious on. Lars could top that off. Filling out the lineup. I mean, Chris Buescher has been amazing. It is wild how consistent this team has been. We're seeing Keselowski be up there. If I can type. We're seeing Brad K be up there. We're seeing maybe you want to look at Blaney as well. I don't know because Blaney did struggle last year in the racing. Yes, he got involved in a wreck, but he wasn't running necessarily that good. We are seeing Blaney show up more and more lately. I'll see what practice says. I'll see what everything else is pointing to. I think Ty Gibbs makes a lot of sense this week. I think Bubba and Reddick make a lot of sense this week. And I'm not trying to completely, list everybody. But for the most part, I think we can assume that these probably 6 drivers are probably going to round out or at least be part of the more expensive group. Okay, so you have, your 9 to 10K, most likely 10, possibly even 11K with Truex and Hamlin. But these are your top guys you want to consider. Buescher, Brad K, Ty Gibbs, Bubba Wallace, probably going to be in your 8K. I doubt they're going to be 7th. But this is probably going to be your 8K field, which I think you want to look at. Past that, we're looking at, value plays, things of that nature. Possibly Harvick. I don't think he'll be necessarily like a 7K play. I'm not seeing a lot of stuff that I really want to see here from Harvick. Like when we look back, fringe top 10 contender. That is concerning. Stenhouse, let's see where Stenhouse is at. I'm pretty sure he's running. So Stenhouse makes a lot of sense. He'll probably be 67, maybe low 7s. Making a lot of sense for a flyer. As I said, we're seeing a lot of Brad Keselowski be well. We're seeing a lot of Buescher be up there. Eric Almirola has been showing a lot of speed, mainly carrying right behind Harvick in terms of qualifying speed. Race speed a little concerning. We look at the value plays. Harrison Burton still probably the best one there. We're seeing Gillen. Down at the bottom, these are Rick Ware starts here. Gregson, concerning. Pretty slow. Jones, I still don't know what to think of fucking Nashville, man. That was nuts. Haley. If I can spell Haley correctly. Haley's there depending on what his price is. The main concern is if he qualifies, if he out-qualifies well, or if he out-qualifies where he should run. But AJ showing speed. We're seeing Colleague in the Cup Series carry speed. Suarez. That's kind of mainly it. That's kind of my main take. We're seeing a lot of these guys down here. it's really just depending on if they can either save themselves and with place differential, which I really don't want to chase. Like even last year, look, the only guys that, when we look at the starting positions, McDowell gets incredibly lucky. Jones gets lucky with coming off of where these cautions were and stuff. They didn't necessarily have a ton of speed. Jones had a lot of current speed at the time, but didn't necessarily show it this weekend. But for the grand scheme of things, a lot of these guys didn't make a lot of huge jumps. Cole Custer basically starts in the back of the field, finished 17th. As I said, we have Chastain, the main chalk, who carried a lot of speed entering this weekend. But for the most part, I don't think I really want to chase a lot of place differential. Or I don't think I'm necessarily going to be giving more than unless it's like Chastain or somebody in like the top portion of this field starting in the outside the teens, like mid-20s or something. I don't think I'm going to be giving anybody like +7 place differential points. It might be like 4 to 5. So place differential for me isn't a huge area to focus on. It isn't a place I want to die on. I mainly want to focus on just playing guys that are showing recent speed, that are showing speed in practice, that are qualifying well, that have good pit stalls, and that I believe are going to just be good, once the field spreads out. And that's really about it. That's really all I can think of right now. These are probably the main guys I want to target and try and build around, specifically between Hamlin and Truex. I really do think these two guys are probably going to be there. If there's a Hendrick driver that's going to compete, it'll probably be Byron or Elliott. Larson to an extent, but he's been wildly inconsistent, a little more than I want to. I think Chris Buescher, Brad Keselowski, Ty Gibbs, and Bubba Wallace make really, really good plays. Regardless of where they start, I think they can hold on to track position if they start up front. I think they can gain track position if they start in teens. They can gain, those 5-6 spots to go from 18th to 12th to 11th, and that's what we're going to need in a race like this. And this is basically just kind of my opinion where I'm at in terms of Pocono this weekend. So I will see you guys in the live shows. Busy weekend this weekend. 4 races, 4 big contests we got to focus on. The truck, Xfinity, F1, Cup Series, 2 each day. Going to be a pretty busy weekend. If you have any questions, if you want to support me, support the work that I do, you can join the Patreon. You can donate through the PayPal link description below. And yeah, I will see you guys in live shows. I'll see you guys then.